Hey, my name's Dave King. You're listening to Talkin' Blues. I play the drums. Sometimes I make records. Sometimes I play the fool.
Tell me how you first got into playing drums. Or is the drums the first instrument?
I came out playing, basically. I was born in '64, year of the invasion, British invasion, Beatles, Ed Sullivan. So I almost couldn't help but be thrust into that community. In fact, when my mother called home to tell my brother and sister I was born, I had jet black hair, used to have hair, to here, pointing to my forehead, and she said, "You have a little beetle baby brother." So that's how far back that goes. And I guess just because of that culture and the time, my folks bought me little drums, little toy drums. And prior to that, I remember this thing as a little toy that was a piece of wood with dowel stuck in it. And you had a wooden hammer and you used to go bam, 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 and then turn it over and then repeat earnestly, turn it over. So I spent probably a good year of my life.
Pounding away.
Yeah. And then as I go back to look at old Super 8 film, the recordings that we used to do when that was a thing in the 60s, as early as Christmases 65, 66, my parents were buying me little drum kits, and wasn't old enough to really, my mother would pick me up and put me behind the kit. So it wasn't a conscious thought about thing. I just been playing ever since. It's only recently I've been thinking to myself, what the hell am I doing with my life? Getting these pieces of metal and mylar with pieces of wood.
So you never questioned it. You never thought, well, I would rather do something else or
Only once that I questioned it, and it was because I was asked the question in high school when my guidance counselor sat me down and said, "Well, what are you going to do for a living?" I had never thought about it until then because it was always an obvious situation where I was just going to play music. I said, "Well, I'm a musician, I guess. I play music." And he's like, "Oh, no. What are you going to do for a living? You can't, that's not a career." And I said, "Photographer?" And then he said, "Okay, well, let's look at Sheraton College because they have a good photography program, et cetera, et cetera." So that's kind of really the only time I ever thought about it. It was never a conscious decision to play music or to do this as a career. It just kind of happened that way.
did you pursue the lessons in photography, the
I did
studies?
not, but I loved taking pictures when I was a kid. In fact, I always used to have a little Instamatic camera when I went to concerts. So when I was at Rush shows in 1976 or Queen shows in 1977, I would always take around my little camera. That got me into a couple of gigs, by the way, too. I just showed the camera to the security people, pretty loose security in the '70s. It's like, go ahead. Got backstage into a Rush show. I think it was Guelph, and got some really great shots that they exist somewhere, but they've never been publicly displayed. But yeah, so to answer the question, I didn't pursue it in a formal way, but I always loved taking pictures. And when I went on the road, I would always take my camera and go take a few shots here and there.
When were you in your first band?
Oh, good question. Technically, I guess my first official band, I was 11 and 10 or 11, and the band was called Molten Rock. Still one of my favorite band names. Ron Sexsmith and I, we compare notes with band names. He had one of my favorite band names called Raunch. Ronch, which I just to this day I still can't believe how great a band name it is. So I email him from time to time and say, "Look, man, when are we putting Raunch back together? I think it's time." Anyway, so that was Molten Rock, and it was a legit band. I was a little kid. Everybody else was 15, 16, 17 or older. I was 10 or 11. But again, because I sort of came out playing, I could already keep up, if you will. I could already play. So they needed somebody to play drums, and my first gig I got paid in quarters. when I was 11. Crestwood Vocational School.
What kind of music were you playing?
Rock. It was hits of the day, you know, so it would have
Not
been
just rock, but molten rock.
molten rock. Yeah, if you were there, you were in jeopardy of being moltenized. Uh, yeah, it was hits of the day, you know, Alice Cooper. We're an American band by Grand Funk. Of course, we changed it to we're a Canadian band. Uh, things of that nature. It was a pretty eclectic blend of stuff, and it was really cool. You know, it's like some Steely Dan stuff and everything from like I say, kind of. Well, I was going to say classic rock, but it wasn't classic rock then. It was just hits of the day. So it was kind of a mix of stuff, and I could already play, and so that was kind of my first foray into a band setting proper, probably when I was 11. But I played in a little Italian wedding band or Portuguese wedding band. Prior to that, did one show that I remember. And I remember being pissed off at it because the guy who was introducing us, I think it was in Portuguese, might have been Italian. He introduced us as a bunch of kids. You know, here's a bunch of kids coming up here to play some music for you. And I had to ask after. I said, what did the guy say when he introduced the band? He said, I was pissed because I was serious. I wasn't just a kid getting up there and having fun goofing around. I was real serious, man. You know, that's so kind of funny when I think back at that. So it's been a fairly intense process, I guess, from that stage moving forward. You know, it took things very seriously that way with a Monty Python slice on the side.
Like, was there a moment where you realized this is what you do?
I'm still thinking about it. Um, I had various moments. I had various sort of epiphanies here and there of not more, is this what I'm going to do, but more like, how am I going to do this? You know? So when I was young, again, I can't, I'm guessing like 7, 8, 9, 10. I started taking drum lessons at a place called Wright's Music. I've got so many these serendipitous full circle stories. But so Wright's Music was a place on Concession Street in Hamilton, East Mountain. And Bill and Bob Wright ran the shop, Scottish guys. And my folks were Scottish, so I guess there was some kind of connection there. Sax player, drummer. And so, yeah, I studied there for a little bit. And I remember being chastised once about, you know, Bob was like, "Oh, you're a great wee drummer, laddie, but you got to learn how to read." You know, to this day, it's still an uphill battle. But fast forward, 30 something years later, I was at a club called the Bermuda Onion. I'm not sure if you're aware of that place in
Yeah, yeah.
Toronto. Elvin Jones is playing. I had to go see Elvin. I mean, it's Elvin, right? And who's there? Mr. Wright. So, hey, Mr. Wright, great to see you. Turns out he's buddies with Elvin because I guess he hooked up with him when he was playing with Coltrane, perhaps in Buffalo or something. I'm not sure what the connection was there. So I got to meet Elvin, and it was a really uncomfortable moment because Mr. Wright introduced me as a great wee drummer. And you just don't do that in front of Elvin Jones. I mean, that's greatness. I was just a guy, you know.
Right.
So again, yeah, a lot of full circle stories there. So when you talk about those moments of, did you decide or did you do this or that? It was more those kinds of things, where I studied with Mr. Wright, and then I went on to conservatory because a guitar player friend of mine studied there. So conservatory music. Miss Thurston was her name. Crazy, I remember that. But so I took drum lessons there for a bit, and a local couple teachers here and there. But I guess a big moment for me would have been meeting a drummer, Paul DeLong, out of Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And
great drummer.
Oh, phenomenal. I owe a lot to Paul, and I can tell you a bit about that. So my brother Steve is a guitar player. So through him, there was tons of music in the house since I was a kid because he was a big music fan, huge influence on me when I was a kid. He was really into Dominic Triano. And there's a club called the Colonial in Toronto. Are you familiar with that place?
Yes.
So that place was great because upstairs kids could go because it was a restaurant, and then downstairs was the more bar atmosphere. So my brother, being the great guy that he was, when bands were coming through like that, I'd come to Toronto. I was living in Hamilton. He was living in Toronto at the time as a full time musician. I'd take the bus out. I was 13, you know, I was pretty young when I think about it now. And so he would take me to these shows. So I'd see Buddy Miles, drummer from Jimi Hendrix, and, you know, all these great artists. And I saw Dominic Triano play there once. And of course, I had my camera, like we talked about earlier, took shots of Dominic and had a great shot. I'm a chubby little kid with frizzy hair, and Dominic was just such a gracious, beautiful guy. And I met Paul just briefly, you know. And then fast forward to a few years later, I was 16 at the time, and I just got my license. So I was driving to Toronto for the very first time by myself in my car. I'm going along McQuaid. That's, you know, that was a frequent stop with my brother and I if we go to Toronto. And at that time, they may still be doing that. They would give you stuff if you just signed for it. They would give I was 15, like prior to going in by myself. I want to buy a snare drum. Okay, man, here. Write your name here. And here it's like $8 a month. Along McQuaid, without that institution, there's probably a lot of us hanging around that maybe wouldn't have had the great opportunity to play like we did because they would almost just give you stuff and hope you would pay for it.
Right.
Anyway, so I was going down to Long and McQuaid on Bloor when the location was at Bloor, and I'm downstairs and I see this guy, and I was like, "Geez, that looks a lot like Paul DeLong." But I've only seen him live once, and of course on record. So I went up and said, "Excuse me, are you Paul DeLong?" He said, "Well, yes, I am." You know, and we started chatting, and I said I'd seen you before with Dominic Triano. I said, amazing, great honor. He's such a phenomenal player. Paul was great back then, never mind where he is now. So we got to chatting, and I said, I'm looking for a teacher, as well, while I'm in Toronto here, just kind of, and he's like, well, I teach. So that was one of those moments that you're talking about. And I was just blown away at the fact that he would teach drums because I assumed that anybody that was on a record back then, if you were on a recording, you're a multimillionaire.
Right.
Only the select few of us get to be on records, and so I didn't think he would do something like teaching because he'd be so busy flying all over the world, in gold planes, in Lamborghinis, and Anyway, so quickly found out that that wasn't the case. But Paul was great to me. He took me under his wing, and I sort of became the thing that wouldn't leave from his house. So I'd go for a lesson and I'd just stay all day. God bless him. He should have kicked me. I mean, it's just ridiculous to think of now. And I talk about that with him. I said, Paul, what the hell? Why didn't you just erase, lose my phone number and never pick up the phone when I called? He's just not that guy. He was just so wonderful. I learned both musically on the drum set and also too in the business from Paul, because he just started playing with Kim Mitchell at that time. They were just starting rehearsals, and of course Max Webster were one of my favorite bands of all time at that point. So there was this great sort of I describe it like the sea was parting in the mist, because here was this guy that played with Triano, who I loved, and then Kim Mitchell, all this just great fortuitous synchronicity happening. So I learned so much from Paul on the drum set primarily, but also just as important, and sometimes maybe more importantly, about the music industry, because I saw him go through everything from the infancy of the band to Maple Leaf Gardens and all points in between. So just an incredible education, and Paul was very gracious and open and sharing all of that stuff with me and allowed me to hang around.
Is there something that you could share with me about what you might have learned business-wise from him without revealing anything specific? I mean,
No, absolutely. It's all public knowledge. Anyway, so I learned about the sideman position in bands or in solo artists' career. So and this was kind of reinforced a lot later when I watched the Sting documentary, and Daryl Jones is being interviewed, and he's saying, in terms of what he's doing with Sting, I'm not sure if this is a band or not, meaning that is it a band? And of course, it's not a band. It's Sting, and you're at Sting's table, like Miles Copeland eloquently went on to say a little later in the interview. So with Paul, it was a similar kind of a thing. It's like this is a band, and it was a sort of a band proper when you're looking at the development and the input and the hang and everything like that. But then, the search for success is kind of a funny one sometimes. So I think Kim ended up getting a producer, um, and the producer decided that Paul wasn't rock enough, which is absolutely insane in my
Hmm.
humble opinion. They'd already done like Gopher Soda and all and the EP and those records, and Paul was phenomenal for that gig. To me, he was a perfect fit. In fact, it was one of the high points of the show. Paul and Kim, their chemistry. So, like you do, you hire a producer when you're making a record, and that's who you delegate. It's like, okay. And so Kim acquiesced, and it's like, sorry, dude, we got to get somebody else in to do this record. And of course, that was crushing for Paul at the time. I think he would probably agree with that. That's my opinion of how that went down. It was quite a blow because you invest so much of yourself, so much of your time, and you just look for reciprocity with that, like, pound for pound. And when situations like that happen, you come to realize everybody's replaceable, absolutely everybody. So, to answer your question, that was something that I learned off the drum throne and just witnessing all of that. And that was great, for a teenager to be privy to all of that from an inside information standpoint. So
It's
yeah, I
in,
was just grateful to be there.
it's interesting how, I mean, that idea of sideman, because I presume when you first started playing the drums, you never thought, I want to be a sideman, right?
I wanted to be in Rush. I wanted to be in Queen. I wanted to be in the Beatles. I wanted to be in a band. It's so funny because I never actually really did that in my career, but that's I think how a lot of us sort of start out, especially for my era. I used to read Circus magazine all the time, and that I was going to be in there at some point, with Kiss and The Who and the aforementioned. I didn't think about being a sideman or being anything. It was just like certainly being a drummer, you have to be in a band. I didn't have visions of Gene Krupa or Buddy Rich or that never really entered my orbit. I just wanted to play songs in a band. So yeah, yeah. In terms of that approach, that's kind of how I always thought. And then with this education, you learn things and you see how stuff actually works.
And maybe less, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe the idea of being a sideman was less apparent back then. Whereas now it's
Yeah,
like it's the way of life for a lot of people.
it wasn't so clear. It wasn't so clear. Now, I guess I should retrace that because when I was working in an Italian wedding band, for example, it wasn't a band. It was very, very clear that this guy was hired to do weddings, and I played with him. So I guess maybe it was a bit of a band concept at the time. Certainly from an exploitational standpoint, because you rehearse for free in a band. you um, so yeah, yeah, the delineation certainly wasn't as it is today, for sure.
So, having found out this whole concept of being a sideman and also being very replaceable, what kind of impression did that make on you?
I didn't really alter anything as a result of. It was more just an awareness. I didn't think to myself, oh, I won't do this or I won't do that. It was just more of like, okay, that's how things can roll in the industry. So be prepared. Be prepared for this type of environment. Nobody's exempt, and it doesn't reflect what type of job you're doing on the job. So don't take it personally. Paul was phenomenal. Not that he did a good job and he sort of made it and he was kind of okay and that they'd get somebody good when the opportunity presented itself. He was phenomenal. So that taught me to not take those situations so personally because it's a chemistry thing. And Paul de Villiers was obviously searching for something that he wasn't feeling on the session. Fault or not, doesn't matter. It's just that was the environment. So you can try to put super groups together, and we've seen them, both of us have seen them in the past, and they just don't work sometimes. Chemistry is a funny thing. If you applied it to hockey, then there'd just be one winningest team every year, the one that had the most money. They just hired the best of the best, put them on the ice, and win every game, every time. As we know, things don't quite work like that,
Right.
you know?
So, musically, what did you aspire to be as a drummer back then? Was it mainly rock? What kind of drummer did you want to be?
No, the funny thing is, because my brother was a guitar player, he brought just the music of the day into the house. So, in other words, it wasn't like drum concentric stuff like we had mentioned, Buddy Rich, or it wasn't those kinds of things. It was the Cream, it was Jimi Hendrix, it was the Animals, those types of bands in the 60s, mostly guitar players. So I was drawn to that, to music. And even when I became a Rush fanatic, 1974, 75, when the first album was out, it wasn't because of the drums, because certainly at that point, John Rutsey was playing drums on the first record and the first stuff. And, he was just a rock and roll, straight up kind of drummer. When Neil joined the band, it was more like, whoa, here's a force to be reckoned with behind these drums. But again, I still didn't aspire to be that drummer. It wasn't until much later when I was 15, around 15, my brother gave me an album for my birthday called Tony Williams' Lifetime. And that was with Alan Holdsworth on guitar, Alan Pasqua, Tony Newton. That record turned my listening experiences upside down. And the reason for that is they call it fusion. It's a bit of a cold term for me, but just a blend of whatever. Because it blended the rock element and the power that I loved about all of the stuff that we're talking about with this other weird gear that I wasn't familiar with. And that was the jazz influence and that harmonic content that I didn't have a lot of exposure to. I think that record was recorded in 75. And I went, oh man, now this is something that is super intriguing to me. What is going on here? It wasn't like Keith Moon, who Keith I love, played a lot of drums, and Keith gets a bad rap because it's the Loon the Moon, Moon the Loon, like Maniac.
Right.
He was a phenomenal drummer in terms of composition, orchestration. Those two things don't get thrown around with Keith's name very much. But so I was familiar with a lot of drumming, like Ginger Baker, Mitch Mitchell, like I say, Keith in this rock context, which I become somewhat familiar with because you'd heard it all the time. But I'd never heard this before. And it just knocked me out. I went, wow, you can do that on the drums. Well, Tony could do that on the drums, and then there's the rest of us. So that sort of set that thing in motion of like, okay, great. And then when I met Paul a couple of years later, or a year and a bit later, whatever it was, he was heavily influenced and still is by all of that music. So that there was that convergence. So that changed. You asked about, light bulb moments or those kinds of points. That changed things quite a bit for me at that point in time. And that might have sown the seed for where I got to when I started my own band.
Okay, so as a drummer, it's not always easy to dictate the kind of music you want to play. Does that mean that you have to start your own band in order to do that?
That's kind of what happened. So, with all of this study that I was doing and on all of this new music that I was being exposed to, and I wasn't I love singing. It's a love hate thing. I like it when I sound okay, and I hate it when I don't, which is probably most of the time. So I didn't pursue the singing leave on thing. Um, Tony didn't sing, certainly not on that record. So I sort of saw, well, you could do that. And I was going to school at Mohawk College. I was going to school at Humber College for music. And after that, I kind of wanted to do something a bit different, and a bit more of my own making for what you were talking about. Like, if you want to play this music, I was sort of joking with Paul at one point. Nobody's going to call you necessarily in Hamilton, Ontario to join a fusion band or a jazz rock thing or something like that. So I started my own, and was very humble beginning and not huge aspirations to do anything except play with a bunch of friends and try to do some of this music justice. And then I started writing for fun, because we needed material.
How do you write? On the drums?
No, when I was writing at that point, it was actually, you might be able to see it, where that keyboard right back there. I bought that keyboard in the 80s. Probably, yeah, sometime whenever it came out. It was the latest and greatest, the Ensoniq ESQ1. And it had a sequencer in it, which was pretty cool for back in the day. It was primitive sequencer, but a sequencer nonetheless. So what that would allow lazy people like me to do is to be able to come up with the parts that you wanted in this composition, program them into the sequencer, and have them spit back out at you, and play it a lot better than you would be able to play them. Certainly I would myself. So what I would do is I'd maybe start with a bass line, come up with a bass line for a section of a tune, and then come up with some chords, program that, and then when the next section was coming up, go to my sequencer, and et cetera, et cetera. And then when it came time to write the melodies, there was nothing really fluid enough on the keyboard for me, and certainly my dexterity wouldn't allow for me to get the kind of melodies that I was looking to get out. So I would sing them. I just sing the melody, and then from that I would dump the ESQ1 sequencer stuff onto a multi-track cassette recorder, and then I would sing the melody into the 4-track, and you just use the tools that you have.
How difficult was it to start this band, and was this the band Rapid Transit that you started?
It was actually quite easy, because ignorance is bliss. I had a guitar player friend that I had worked with when I was younger, named Brian Griffith. I don't know if you know Brian at all, but Brian was a phenomenal guitar player. We lost him a few years ago. So I worked with a pop band, a top 40 band, with Brian a number of years earlier. And like I said, Brian was just an absolute phenomenal guitar player and super funny guy, lovely person. He was a little older than I was, and super well versed in all styles of music. He could play Wes Montgomery as well as he could play Police tunes. So when I started this, I had this idea to start a band or to do this musical thing. Brian was kind of the only guy that I thought of. I thought, well, he's my only call because he gets all of this stuff. And again, I'm an amalgam of, like I said, all of these elements and not just one particular thing. I don't have a great strength in any area. Musically necessarily. So I called Brian, and Brian said, yeah, man, I'm up for it. So like I described the process of writing, just by great coincidence, Brian was down the street. He was living down the street with a gal on Canada Street in Hamilton, which is where we're from. So I would ring him up and say, okay, Brian, I got a new one. And he would come down, and I would play him the tape, and he would go, great. So he'd learn the chords and learn the melody. And that's how that whole process started. because I was going to Mohawk College, music program, which is now defunct, unfortunately, as of next year, which is a bit of a drag for young folk. Because I was there, there was a bunch of people available to sort of choose from in those areas, and so from that came a keyboard player, Rob Fouquet, and Rob again, phenomenal talent, just lovely guy, great piano player, and great writer as well. So he joined the fold, and there was a couple of different moving parts that happened because of my association with Humber College. I went there for a semester in Toronto. I had a few friends that I asked to come out and play. Charlie Huntley was one on saxophone, and Dave Leftoff was playing bass with us at that period for a little bit. I had a local guy named Attila Darvis who had just emigrated from Hungary. And so I just put this thing together, and we started this house gig at a place called the Gown and Gavel in Hamilton. So that was the lab. And I thought, well, with repetition, live rehearsal, trial by fire, and all that. So that's kind of where we forged the identity or the sound of the band, was in that room. And we had victims coming in on a weekly basis. Some of them actually remember it. So that's kind of where that whole thing started. So in taking it a step further, I thought, well, once we get a couple of tunes together that are worthy of recording, we should probably do that. There was a friend of mine who had a label in Hamilton called Roto Noto. Roto Noto, Randall Cousins was his name. And he said, I'd love to put a recording out if you want to do a recording. So we went into Grand Avenue in 1988 and did our first 2 tracks. And then we went on to do a couple of different CDs.
I'm curious, when you went in to do the first 2 tracks, how much recording experience did you have?
Only home recording.
Okay.
Which is, not very commonplace back in the day. So a bunch of the Molten Rockites, they had tape, home tape machines like an Akai 2-track or 4-track or TIAC 4-track that we would record onto original songs. I think one of the titles was Murder for Love. I still remember it. So that was kind of my only recording experience informally. And I had machines at home, like we had mentioned. I had an Akai 2-track reel-to-reel tape machine at one point, which meant you could overdub. So no, it was very bold, actually, or stupid, whatever you want to call it. But now, one incident that led to probably that situation happening was I got some free studio time offered to me at Sheridan College. That was, I guess, my first formal studio setup, although it wasn't it wasn't a commercial studio per se. It was set up. They had a great Studer 24-track 2-inch tape machine, which is still 16-track Studer, which is still my favorite tape machine to this day. So that was my introduction. We went in there, a couple of friends from Humber, and this fellow named Rob Selmanovic, who was, I guess, doing an engineering project or study at Sheridan at the time. He was the guy behind the dials. So fast forward, when I went to think about recording, I called Rob. And I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this band thing. You want to look for a studio with me? He's like, sure, do you know any? Hamilton area? Not really. So we looked at a couple of places, and of course we went to Grant, and I told the story a couple of days ago to Graham Rockingham. We went into the studio, and I came in with Rob. Now, from the studio perspective, I'm just thinking later, when you start thinking historically, Bob Doige, the owner at the time, used to be Dan Lanois' studio, and Bob Lanois and Dan and Bob Doige started that whole thing back in the day. So here's this kid coming in with this, he's got his own engineer, and Bob is quite an accomplished engineer. I mean, geez, you have to go far and wide to get much better. You could have asked Gordon Lightfoot.
Right.
or you two or whoever. Anyway, so we went in there and Rob deemed it fit. Yeah, there were a couple things that weren't quite up to snuff, but he deemed it fit to go in and make this recording. So we did that. And then I quickly found out about dynamics and, like we talked about, chemistry and things on the floor very quickly because Rob had a different idea as to how the music should or could sound than what I did. And I found that, again, a great learning experience because we didn't talk about it. We just got in there and started working. And he was kind of more influenced by this softer Pat Metheny sort of sound. And here I was, Rush, Miles Davis, Electric Maniac, who was thrashing guy. So there was a bit of separation of concept or idea, and it wasn't like a hostile thing or whatever. It was just that learning experience. And I met this young guy who just started at the studio named John Oliveira. He was assisting there and just kind of got a gig there. And he and I hit it off. He was a extremely passionate Portuguese fella. And we hit it off. So after we did that first recording, which was a single, two songs, one called Glass Diamond and the other called Lunch Meat, two E's, just to be clever. Once we did that, we put that out. Randall put that out on Roto Noto, and it did really well, surprisingly. For instrumental, jazzy, funky music, whatever, at that time, it wasn't really the thing that was coming out of Hamilton, Ontario. So it was a bit of a surprise when we were getting all the feedback from the radio stations supporting it and saying, this is great, we really like it. And internationally, it was getting some play. So then again, all right, let's do something about that. So we went in to do a full length CD in '89. And I had John working in the studio with me. And I didn't realize that he didn't know what he was doing. So there was two of us not knowing what we were doing and having a grand old time at it. Because, like I'd said earlier, ignorance is bliss in that respect. I didn't know you could or couldn't do this or that. So I would just go for it. You have an idea, a concept, go for it. And it wasn't until later, until the record had been out for years, he said, man, you almost killed me on that record. I went, what are you talking about? He said, well, punching. So punching is a technique that, for younger folk who don't know tape machines, when you're recording on tape, you have to erase whatever you're recording over top of. So in other words, if you have a guitar solo that maybe you're not completely happy with, if you want to record a new guitar solo, you have to erase that guitar solo and record a new guitar solo. So the commitment factor was heavy. It wasn't like Pro Tools and playlisting where you have 85,000 guitar solos and you make a good one.
Right.
So I didn't realize at the time I was asking John to punch in physically impossible parts. So I'd have a note. I just want ba-da-bap. And he'd go, okay, man, so where does that come in? It'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, ba-da-bap, and then out. So you're in and out for that phrase. So if you get in too early, you erase what's before it. Or if you go in too long, you erase what's after it. So, and that's grounds for having your head cut off when you're an engineer, because you're just not supposed to do that. It doesn't happen.
And there's no undo function.
There's no undo, man. You're not going back. You've just done it, and that's it. So John said later, he goes, dude, you had me standing on my head, but I didn't know. I didn't know any different. I just was an idea that you would have. You wanted it executed. You were trying to do it. So he was the guy to push the buttons, and so we had a good chuckle about that later on. So yeah, I just learn. Every time I walk into the studio, it's still the same today. You learn something. If you have an open mind and you're up for it. I was in Nashville, a few weeks back doing sessions with friends, and I always learn something.
Is it correct to assume that your love of studio recording, your work as a producer, that kind of started around this time?
I was the producer on that record. Now, that's a funny title for me. It's a kind of a lofty title, certainly from my perspective and with what I do, because I consider George Martin a producer, proper.
Right.
So George, as we know George Martin, for those who don't know, Beatles producer, um, Abbey Road, EMI Studios. George was an orchestrator. You know, he could write the string parts. He knew where the cellos were supposed to go. He knew the oboes went here. And he was a brilliant, brilliant guy. So that to me was a producer. I couldn't do any of that stuff. I still can't do any of that stuff. Now, having said that, I'm lucky enough that I think I have a half decent set of ears. And that's probably one of the only things in a complimentary fashion I'll admit to about myself. And that's not through development, it was a gift. Um, so my ears are pretty good, and I have a half decent understanding of how things fit together and can work together in tapestry. So music to me was just kind of that, you know, forging things together, trying to put things together. So yeah, my love of doing that is just from the tinker concept. Is I love noodling and tinkering with these kinds of things and seeing what'll fit and maybe what won't fit. So I didn't really set out to be a record producer proper. I do love being in the studio. I mean, it might be my favorite spot to work, you know. I like the stage, I like playing, maybe less so these days, or, you know, the older I get, but I just loved being in the studio, and I would be in the studio for hours and hours, much to the chagrin of the engineers. Sometimes there would be a second engineer that would come in, which was ridiculous because you can't hear anything after a certain while. But it didn't matter because, again, that pursuit of that quest for whatever it was we were looking for was so strong, it just continued, you know, and it still continues to this day. It's still kind of it's a very similar thing. So, yeah, I didn't set out to be a producer because, like I said, that's, you know, I still, you know, I get called a producer, but I'm very sort of careful about that, you know.
Okay, so Rapid Transit goes on to do a couple of albums. It is definitely a band, you get to tour internationally with it. Tell me, what did you learn from that experience of being in that band?
I learned a ton, and I also forgot a ton because in doing this reboot, we haven't played together in 30 years. Doing this reboot, there was that seminal moment where I was sitting there going, oh, now I remember why I stopped doing this.
Sorry, stop doing being
The
in the
band
band?
thing. Yeah, because it was a mountain of work, a mountain of work from designing the posters to making sure the tickets were at the, you know, the record shop, to writing the music, to performing the music, rehearsing the music, doing the PR, doing the thing, booking the gigs, doing the, you know, wardrobe, you name it, right? And even with doing this, Mako, like coming back to doing it, walking past my drum kit, which needs a lot of attention, to do an interview or to do what I have to do with social media, that's a whole other thing, man. I'm not a social media guy. I'm not really an interview guy. Walking past the kit is all like, damn, you know, that hour I really need behind the drums. I really need to work, you know. So that's what I learned. I learned that if you wanted to do something of that nature, um, it requires a lot of different uh, things to be connected to or concerned with that weren't necessarily musical in nature. And I just kind of lost interest in that whole thing. You know, I just didn't want to be that guy doing all that stuff. And here we are doing it again.
So, what made you go back 30 years later and say, well, why don't we get together again?
Well, I'm not a revisionist, and I'm not a guy that goes back. I'm not really a guy that does, you know, look, you know, laments or whatever. I'm on to the next bit, the next thing. But last year, I sort of got itchy feet a little and thought, well, I'd maybe like to start a new project, you know, a new band, a new thing of some sort, not a band or not a solo thing. I didn't really have anything um, distilled in mind, and I'm not feeling particularly vocal at this period. You know, I have done a couple of records where I was a vocalist on, you know, two solo records and a couple of albums under the moniker The Heavy Dream, which is like more pop rock whatever you call it stuff. So I just we moved. My wife and I moved from Hamilton to Nova Scotia. In doing so, you got to uncrate things that have been sitting in boxes for years. I was like, oh, this transit stuff and this poster, I remember this and that. So maybe that kind of rung a bell in that way. And then I thought, well, the 30th anniversary is coming up, I guess, of this record. And so that's a nice round number. And I thought, I wonder. And I tried to talk myself out of it being a bad idea for months, without exaggeration. Months. It's like, don't. Why would you want it? That's just ridiculous. No, and second part B, nobody cares. Nobody's interested. Not in a oh geez, nobody cares. Just like who cares? This band hasn't been around for 30 years, and I don't talk about it, and I don't go online and post things, and I hadn't until a month ago. So that's kind of how it came about. It was just that I wonder. And because I don't recognize that band, I don't recognize those musicians and that music from 30 years travel time, I thought, I wonder if it'll be new. I wonder if it'll feel like something different. So I was able to be objective somewhat, to sit back. I listened to some of the music. I went, that is god awful. That's just, I don't like, that's embarrassing from composition, and I played too much. This is ridiculous. I'm talking over people, etc., etc. And then I got to the point where there was a few things where I was like, I'm actually kind of enjoying this. This is not so bad. And so I started to get that feeling again. And then I thought, I wonder, So then I practiced a bit, played a little bit, thought, is this fun? Am I having fun? That was the whole premise, at this advanced age. It's not to set the world on fire necessarily, although that little kid vision probably never quite leaves us entirely. It wasn't to do anything like that. It was to hang out with some old pals, play some challenging music, certainly challenging to me because I haven't been in that seat for that long. I had a couple of dalliances with different things. We could talk about that later. So many stories, right? So many different converging things. But so after I got past it's a terrible idea, you can't play anymore, you don't like this music, it's a total disconnect. Once I abandoned that and the good stuff came in, then I vetted the idea with friends who will tell you, that shirt looks like shit. Those are the guys I talk to. It's like, no, man, that's a good idea. I think that would be cool. I don't know. And then talk to another couple, and then everybody was a resounding kind of a yes. So that was encouraging as well. And then I called the band, I talked to the band, and everybody was down. They were all like, oh, that sounds great, man. That'd be a lot of fun. Because I half expected it to be, are you kidding me? So much work and so little pay, kind of like it always has been. You're working 10 hours and getting paid, if you're lucky, 30 minutes. So all that kind of came together. And then the 30th, and I started talking to a friend who owns a studio in Hamilton called the Mule Spinner, Glenn Marshall, great Hamiltonian pal from way back in the day. And I wanted to do it in a different venue, different spot, art space. So there's a place called the Cotton Factory in Hamilton that's been a refurb. And it's a cotton factory from, 100 years ago or longer. I'm not quite sure when it originated, but so I wanted to do it there. He thought it was a great idea, so we kind of put it together from that point moving forward. And that was last November that it was kind of greenlit, if you will. And I was working for months prior to the green light, and then I haven't stopped from the November point to now, which is coming up on May. So that's how the thing sort of got underway. And then we did a rehearsal, and it was fun and funny. Like I was saying, we were laughing about how much we didn't remember. And were you on that gig? Oh, yeah, I was there. Well, no, you weren't, because the sax player was, just having those moments, right? So we rehearsed, and then we rehearsed again, and I did some more listening. And the reception has been great. It's been really warm for the few people that remember the band. And I think some folk are planning on coming out. So I wanted to make it a bit of a happening, if you will. So I got the original photographer, Jose Crespo, who did the shots for the first CD. He's at the Cotton Factory. So we reconnected there, and I said, "Look, would you be interested in, maybe doing a show prior to the show?" So he's the opener, right? He's like, "Yeah, that sounds great." He's a fantastic photographer, so I thought, well, that would be nice instead of having a band open. Let's do this. And a great painter, screenplay writer, musician friend of mine, Terrence Kramer, bringing the old in with the new. Terry's been working on me with some video stuff. We did a record together, and I said, he's a great oil painter, never had a show. But one of those guys, just paints and puts them away. I said, would you be interested in being a part of this opening with Jose? He's like, yeah, that sounds great. So we have that component together with the painting and the photography, which we talked about. I have a bit of a connection with, and then doing it in this cool old cotton factory, old wood, stone, foundations, and putting it together so there's a cool feeling and aesthetic to it, and not just playing at a club. Not that there's anything wrong with playing at a club, but it's just I didn't want to do that.
Will it be a one-off?
I don't know yet. Again, because of the mountain of work we talked about. A few friends had said, well, you've done so much work, it just would kind of make sense to just do more, just carry on. But we'll see how much fun we have and see if folk come out and if it's good and feels good. It's been a bit of a love fest. We've been having a good time, the guys in the band, the people. And it's the same band, by the way, from 30 years ago. It was the last incarnation. Everybody's still with us. Brian Griffith had passed, like I'd said. But we have Kevin Vino on guitar. And I brought so many stories again. Kevin and Mike Felice, a sax player who had been with the band for a number of years. Kevin was a new member the last go-round 30 years ago when we were playing. They'd never been on a record with the band. So the master tapes of this record, Speed, Rapid Transit Speed, which was our third release, technically. I guess fourth if you consider the single, but a third CD. The master tapes don't exist because the studio got sold that I recorded at a place called Highland in Stony Creek, Mountain Stony Creek, just outside of Hamilton. So I didn't have any master tapes. So I couldn't go back and remix or do anything like that, which was a great thing because I would have still been mixing it now. So it was kind of a bit of a blessing and a curse in a way. But what I did find with the move that we talked about was I found some old DAT tapes, which we used to mix the record at that time, which was a wonderful invention because unlike quarter-inch tape, which was only 16 minutes long, you could only mix 3 songs in a bit. With these DAT tapes, man, you could mix for an hour. Again, blessing and a curse. So I found these DAT tapes, and lo and behold, they still worked. And I discovered these alternate takes of a couple of the songs that we'd recorded for Speed that I forgot about, I was like, wow, these are actually fairly complete. And generally the reason I wouldn't use alternate takes, or we recorded some of these songs with different members, different bass players, different guitar players, just to get a different sort of a feel or have a different approach. And I generally played horribly and didn't use that performance and then moved on to something else. So that's why the songs that ended up on the record ended up there and these alternate takes didn't. So I had to revisit it and go, how badly did I play? So the level of embarrassment wasn't so bad that I didn't feel uncomfortable about reusing it. Some stuff, maybe not so much. So I thought, well, I need a guitar part on this song called Rerun, which Kevin Vino came in and played wonderfully. And then I needed a sax melody for this song called Simpatico, which Mike Felice came in and, of course, played wonderfully on as well. So we got this neat full circle thing of a couple of bonus tracks and the current band members, which are the old band members, appearing on the CD for a 30th anniversary and the concert. And so just nice convergence that way.
That's pretty neat that you can go back and revisit this. In that 30-year period, one of the reasons why I know you is with your work with Steve Strongman.
Right.
How did that happen?
Uh, that started back in, I think, around 95. And here's a neat rapid transit connection for that for you because Dave Leftoff, who was a Humber College guy, I think he went on to teach bass at Humber College eventually. He called me and said, we're really stuck for a gig that I'm doing. We need to sub. And it was this country show band thing out of Kitchener. And that's not really my thing, you know. Not that I don't like that, but I just don't, it's just not in my wheelhouse of stuff. So Dave called, he said, you know, the dough's good. It's a fun band. It's a family band. It was called the Goussays or the Gousset Family Band or something. So I just said, yeah, there's two shows or something. I said, sure, I'll fill in. It could be fun. A good hang with Dave anyway, right? And then I showed up at rehearsal, and there's this guitar player, the skinny kid, you know, with an ES. And he started playing, and I went, damn, this kid can pick, you know. He was really good. And funny, you know, we just hit it off pretty quickly and started chatting. And he's been a good pal ever since that time. So I guess that's where the situation started with Steve and I is back then. You know, I sort of made note of like, watch this guy, you know, watch this kid. He's good. And he went on to do a couple of things with his friend Rob, our friend Rob Zabo with Plasticine, et cetera, et cetera. And then he started doing his own Steve Strongman music, which was a kind of a blues, rock, country jazz, whatever amalgam of stuff, which I loved. And he called me and said, my drummer just left, you know, would you help out and do some stuff with me? He just finished doing his first CD, Honey, and released that. And I said, yeah, sure, you know, I'll hang out for a bit and play. That was in 90, when was that? No, that was 2006. So 96 was when the Goose A's thing was 95, 96. And then I split down to New Orleans, left. I stayed around, by the way, Mako. That was, I didn't finish that part of the story. When Dave called me, I stayed around for like almost a year playing in that show band. And so Steve and I developed a great relationship just doing that, you know, hanging. And so then I left to go down to New Orleans to do a gig with an artist named Joe Tullis. And I met Pat Sansone from Wilco down there, which is another musical connection story because he and I have been pals ever since. We had an apartment together when we had that gig.
Why did you go to New Orleans?
I went to New Orleans to play with this artist that my friend Bill Dillon was working with. Bill Dillon, I don't know if you know Bill or not, but he's one of the greatest Canadian guitar legends that we have on offer. He's played with all kinds of folk, Robbie Robertson and Joni Mitchell and you name it, you know, Counting Crows and all kinds of different bands. He might be the most recorded Canadian guitarist on record, you know, wow. Figuratively and literally. And he and I are still good pals to this day. Anyway, so Bill had been working with this artist, Joe Tullis, and he said, look, you know, I think you should go to New Orleans because the fella from Blind Melon was playing on the record, on Joe's record, and he's not available to tour. And he said, I think you should go down. This might be a good situation, you know, to go hang out and ingratiate yourself in that community. So that's why I went to New Orleans on Bill's recommendation. I went down and Joe liked what I did, so ended up staying there for 6 months on this gig that I was hired to do, put on retainer, and they paid for my apartment. Pat and I had an apartment together for that 6 months, and that's what brought me down there. And I stayed down there for that 6 month period.
And what did that do for you musically?
It opened my eyes to how, again, the music industry works very differently from a Canadian perspective to an American perspective. So what I learned was the American music industry, or at that time, certainly the people that I was introduced to, they don't sit around waiting for something to happen or looking for something to do that is already proven in terms of a sound alike. What I mean by that is, and I love Canada. I'm a Canadian through and through. It's not a disparaging comment on our country or our community. We have a great music community and a great situation. But the industry in and of itself, certainly at that time, I would find, and I learned just by going to the States, that we would wait until, somebody made it. And then we would be more apt to sign somebody who sounded like that artist who made it because we weren't huge on taking a chance necessarily. Like Rush, for example, they had to go to America to get a record deal. Couldn't get arrested in this country. Neil Young went to LA. Joni went, Robbie went, et cetera, et cetera. So I learned a lot in that respect from talking to people who had just signed a record deal or just got a management deal or just left a deal. Everybody was kind of doing something in the industry, whereas in Canada, a lot of folk were waiting for something to happen, and like, well, I don't know about this. And just this cautious feeling or this sort of wary feeling of commitment or taking chances versus the American thing. And of course, that's painting with a broad brush. I'm not saying specific situation to situation, but that was my takeaway.
Right.
Bill had told me that. He goes, you got to get down to the States, man, and start working down there where the industry is really happening, where there's a lot of stuff going on. It's just 10 times the population, 10 times the amount of stuff, and also 10 times the competition, too. So musically, living in New Orleans, you are in the gumbo, literally. You're walking down the street, and there are musicians there that are just unbelievable talents. And again, you talk about learning. This, why is this a street musician? It's just the way it is. Sometimes somebody will see that street musician and go, wow, you need to be doing this. So I learned that talent didn't mean position in the industry. Sometimes had very little to do with it. I learned that incredibly hard work, dedication, focus, determination would sometimes count more for where you were going to end up in a career or how far you were going to get, quote unquote, in the industry versus somebody who's Bach, Hendrix talent. It just didn't, there wasn't a pound for pound equation there. So I learned a lot in those terms in New Orleans.
What made you come back?
The gig finished. It was a 6-month tenure, and the gig just kind of fizzled out. It was a BMG project affiliate, and it just wasn't supported in a way that allowed the thing to flourish the way it needed to. So I came back home, and then I always get these calls to kind of fill in for stuff because I don't know if people think I'm too busy or just don't want to do stuff of this nature. But I got a call from a friend who was a drum student when he was a kid, Bill Majoris, to join a band called Flux, filling in, just hanging out for a week or two. And I stayed there for a year. And we recorded some music together. So I came back and started doing that. And again, everything's kind of chronological in my head based on records and tours and what I was doing. And so that was 97, 98, that era. And then the fellow we were talking about, Bill Dillon, was working with an artist named Stefan Eicher, who is a Swiss singer-songwriter, Dylan-esque. He's kind of the Sting of Switzerland in terms of popularity, artistry. He's I think still the most popular artist in Switzerland of all time. Anyway, so Bill did a record with Stefan, and he was going on tour. And so I went over to wish him a happy birthday and send him on his way on this tour. And the phone rang. And so Bill picked up the phone and see him. Yeah. Oh, shit. Oh, God. Oh, okay. Well, hang on a minute. So Bill sort of puts the phone down on his chest. He goes, I need you to talk to this fella, Martin Hess. I said, who's Martin? He goes, well, he's the manager of Stefan Eicher, and apparently the drummer can't get into the country because of some technical reason, we'll call it, and we need a drummer for this tour. And I went, oh man, okay. Hello, says David. This is Martin Hess, and Bill says you are the drummer we need to have. So, would you please come to Switzerland? And I said, sure. I'd never been to Switzerland, but he goes, can you come now? This is Saturday, right? Like I think March of '99, maybe. And so I said, not really, Mark. I gotta, I'm married. I have a son. I've got jobs and gigs and things. He goes, okay, I will light a candle for you and see what happens. So call me back, click. So I'm like, Bill. He's like, you got to do this, This is... So I take the CD home.
Okay, so what is it about you that all these people call you, that these opportunities happen, and also the fact that you're asked to fill in and you're there for a lot longer?
Well, I work for cheap. I think it's just adaptability. I love to serve. I love to work with teams. I love to try to discover with folk and also help them realize potentially what they're looking for. I don't need to be a director. I don't need to be anything other than a facilitator and a helper in the quest, for musical excellence or excellence in general, So if I can help facilitate that in any way, I'm here to serve. And I really love doing it. I really enjoy it. In fact, I prefer being in the background and the sort of, the man behind the curtain as opposed to the great and powerful Oz. I just prefer that. I always have.
Okay, so you go back, listen to the CD, and what do you hear?
So I play the CD, and then my wife comes home and asks me, "What the hell are you listening to?" Because I'm not really known to be listening to French music or Swiss German stuff. It's pop music. So yeah, Sting-esque, or with a flavor of Dylan. I don't quite know how to describe it, but anyway, I was listening to the tunes, and I said, "Well, look, it's just at Bill's, and he got this call, and they want me to come over and try to do this thing, this Stefan Eicher fella." I talked to him for a sec, the manager for a second. They seem like good guys, and Bill's saying I got to do it. And she said, "Well, I guess we better pack." Because that's my wife, Kim. She has just been a mountain of support since the day we met 40-something years ago. She hasn't wisened up to the fact that, I'm a bum yet. So, so that was Monday. So the Saturday was the phone call, right? And then the Monday I was on a plane to Switzerland to go rehearse. So in between, I had to call everybody and kind of get permission. I had mentioned I was working with this band Flux. I'm like, "Hey, people, like I got this thing, is it okay? What do you think?" And they're like, "Well, geez, I guess." I kind of had to do it just to see, right? And little did I realize what it was, the gig, because Stefan was a multi-million selling artist over there. And we were just rehearsing in this amazing place. And then they decided I was kind of okay. So they kept me around. And then I got a location switch and moved and did a second set of rehearsals. We rehearsed for 5 weeks before playing a show.
Wow. And
then when we did tour, it was like these amazing European venues, these beautiful old theaters and staying in castles. And it was a ridiculous, very fortuitous opportunity to be able to do that, which ended up at the Olympia. We played at the Olympia in Paris for 3 or 4 nights. And the opening band was Ron Sexsmith. Canadian.
So is that how you got to know him, or did you know him before?
Yeah, that's how we got to know each other. We knew of each other through John Bottomley, mutual friends, but we
Who
never
you
hung
worked
out or really
with?
met. Yeah, yeah, I worked with John. Yeah. Um, so yeah, that's how I ended up in Switzerland and did a couple of years worth of gigs with Stefan, and then I just wanted to be at home. Um, so I came home 2001. My wife and I and son, we bought a farm in Caister Center, this 100-acre 1860 old farmhouse with a giant old barn on the property, which was to me the reason to buy the place. I turned that into a recording studio in 2002, and that's where I stayed for 17 years making records.
Okay, so now when you toured in Europe, you're at a level that's quite different from what you used to. You're touring in a major halls and playing to large crowds. What did that experience teach you?
I learned again about the reinforcement of work and work ethic. Stefan, outside of being a phenomenally talented fella, wonderful human being, he just worked harder than anybody else. So at 8 a.m., he's up designing the next album cover. At 10 o'clock, he's doing an interview. At noon, he's on the train. We're discussing what he's going to be doing for the show and with the lighting technician, etc. Showing up at the venue, fans, signing, record company people, maybe a little bit of food, show, after party, video people, photographers, and repeat. I just went, this is why this fella is successful, and again, so you put that in your bag and say, oh, when you're thinking, oh, I just won't practice that day, or I won't work, or I won't do anything, and then you see the guys who are doing it, and everyone is the same, Mako, that way. Everyone who I know that has a successful career, and when I say successful, I just mean successful. For some folk, a successful career is going to the club down the street and playing, and that's amazing. I'm talking, you know what I mean.
Yeah, for sure.
International level, sustainable success. Anybody that I know that does that, either as an artist, a writer, anybody, the only commonality that I see in all of them, it's not genius, it's not brilliant, it's not talent. Everybody's kind of got some of that. It's work and work ethic and how much they spend on what they want to do with their craft. That's kind of the commonality in everything.
Okay, so you come back. A few years later, Steve calls you and says, I need a drummer. Once again, somebody needs you.
Yeah, again, yeah. So that was 2006. So I came home from doing the European stuff, and we settled in Caister Center 2002, and that's the studio moved in 2002. So Steve was entertaining, doing his own stuff. He wanted to do his own thing, and so we put this record out, Honey, and I went to see the release show with Mel Brown, and it was great. Great to see Steve doing good from our first meeting many moons ago. And then he called, said, my drummer's leaving. I need a guy. I said, well, I'm here. And we just started playing. And the thing I love about working with Steve, there's many things I love about working with Steve, but I'm not really a blues purist. So my blues is kind of like Johnny Winter blues
Right.
from the 60s, early 70s. I learned more about the blues later on in life, and I'm still not steeped or very well versed, but I love that. I love Johnny Winter and live and
Mm-hmm.
that stuff. Again, I love this synthesis and blend of different things. That's why the Tony Williams Lifetime thing got me back in the day. So with Steve, he's not a blues purist. He's drawing from Neil Young. He's drawing from country. He's drawing from AC/DC. Steve loves a whole combination of things. He loves singer-songwriters. He loves pickers and everything. So when he plays, all that stuff comes out in the way he plays. And he's got a great feel. first and foremost. His feel is fantastic. Uh, and he's a great entertainer, and he can write songs, and he plays great guitar, and he's a great guy, So that's kind of how that started. And then it just progressed to, I always said to him, if you just want a drummer, I'm probably not your best guy, but if you need help making records or writing songs or doing things of that nature, I might be of some help in that description, So that's what he decided to do. He wanted to make a second record, and that became, I think it was Blues and Color, was the first record we worked on of the Steve Strongman moniker, and recorded that at the barn.
Right. And then you continue working with him.
Yeah. He's like a bad rash. He won't go away, We're still working together. We've got a show coming up in a couple of weeks.
But then you went away. So what's it like to move from Hamilton to Nova Scotia?
It's been fantastic. And my wife retired. She's an accountant, or was an accountant, still is an accountant, but not as active. So I sort of dabbled in real estate a little bit, buying and selling of properties and whatnot. So we had some places in Hamilton, and I was looking to divest, and I looked out in Nova Scotia for some properties. And so Kim and I, my wife and I, came out and did a tour, a little trip around, and she just was like, "Oh, I love it here. Oh, this is great. Wow, maybe someday we'll retire here." And I'm sure, retirement being eons away. So her job kind of went a little bit south in terms of, just environment. And I said, okay, that's, hang that up. You're done there. So she retired, and I want to move to Nova Scotia. So my son and his beautiful wife, Selena, are in one of the places that we bought in Hamilton as an investment property, rental property. We got them sort of settled there, sold everything else up, and then bought some properties out here and moved into one of them about a year and a half ago now. So I said, as long as I have an airport, I'm fine, So in terms of lifestyle, it's if you're looking for Manhattan, it ain't, don't mix metaphors in that respect, but in terms of in living environment, it's absolutely gorgeous. In fact, I'm actually telling people it's horrible because I don't want that to change. I don't want anybody else to move out here in a selfish way, because there's no traffic.
What?
There's no lineups. There's zero traffic, man. When I go to the airport, it's 38 minutes every time. So it's been lovely from a lifestyle perspective. And I just, I fly back and forth for stuff I need to do.
But career-wise, did you think, oh, what is this going to do and how will it affect me?
Not really. Because I've been, again, with the real estate thing, like we were saying with dabbling, I've always been very choosy about what I wanted to do, not be beholden to something because I had to make money, So I just entertain what I want to do, not in an arrogant way, but just like I said, I'm very choosy. So, the phone's not ringing off the hook anyway. So I just thought, well, if I want to do my own stuff out here in this little studio that I put together, then I can do that. Or if I just want to go for a walk in the woods, I can do that. Or if I want to fly down to Nashville to do a session with, these bands and artists I'm working with down there, that'd be great. If I want to go home and do something with Steve, it's, the world's small via being able to get around. Well, it certainly was more so pre-pandemic. It's become a bit more challenging, as we both know, since then. So I wasn't really too worried about career, in terms of how that was going to be affected. And a lot of folk have asked me, or have you ingratiated yourself into the local community? Because Halifax has a fantastic community of artists, and I haven't had time. I bought a few houses out here, and we were preparing them and getting them ready, and then doing the stuff I'm doing anyway, flying back and forth and this and that. I haven't really had time, but there's a few people who want to introduce me to other people who are here. I've got some friends who are here already. Lowell Campbell, the drummer, who works with, I think it's Our Lady Peace now. Work with a band called Winter Sleep. I think he still has that out here. And Brian Borchert, he's out here. Robbie Crowell, who I met in Nashville, is from Nova Scotia. So he and I sort of connected on both levels. I saw him a couple of months ago, and he's like, "You need to meet this guy. You need to meet this person and this person." So, that might happen at some point in the near future, but it just hasn't as of yet. I've got so many things on the go. Maybe after this rapid transit show in May, when I come home being Nova Scotia now, I'll do that. But when David Wilcox calls, which he just did, I've got a rehearsal coming up with him in a couple of weeks, which just happens to coincide with the transit thing. So, when I'm there, I do what's happening, and I come home and try to figure it out.
Well, it's pretty impressive the way things kind of lined up and all the opportunities that you've had over the years.
Lucky.
But do you think it's luck, though?
I do. What's that old adage, preparation, opportunity, meeting, luck, meeting, or whatever. I'm lucky, man. I'm the luckiest guy I know. I've got a beautiful wife and a beautiful son, and I'm a beautiful, great family, great friends, relative health, knock on wood so far. I just clocked in at 60 a couple of weeks ago. I'm just super fortunate, super grateful and gracious, and appreciative of anything I get, any and everything I get the call for, if I'm lucky enough to do that. I just try to show up prepared and try to serve the best I can. Once we finish the interview here, I've got to get back to those yelling at me, "Hey, man, you need work, so you better do something about that." And I will, I just try to do the best job I can to anybody who is, I was going to say silly enough to call me, but anybody who's called me, I'm so grateful that I can try to hit the mark and meet that opportunity with 110% of whatever's expected, so just lucky, Mako. I'm not a guy, I don't make the scene. I don't do interviews. I don't do podcasts.
What the hell are you doing here then?
Yeah, I like you. So I don't go shake hands. I don't go to the Junos. I don't really do that. Not because I'm standoffish or not because I don't love everyone, because I do. It's just I'm more comfortable working. I'm more comfortable trying to get to work than hustling work. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. And obviously it's worked quite well for you, so
far. So I'm hanging on by a thread, but yeah, so far.
Well, it's great. I feel very lucky that you've taken this opportunity when you don't usually do interviews to talk to me. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure, buddy. It's been a blast.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, pleasure.
All right. You take care of yourself.
All right. Thanks, man.